This is where it all started. Well, okay, maybe not this, but this is where it all started. Back in 2008, when Hyundai decided they wanted a slice of the luxury car pie, they decided not to enter the segment with a new SUV, which was all the rage, or even to create a luxury version of an existing Hyundai product, like Acura and Lexus had been doing successfully. No, they decided that they needed to compete head-on with the Germans. So they created a rear-wheel drive, mid-size luxury sedan to compete with the 5 Series and the E-Class. And then, of course, Genesis was spun off, and we ended up here with the 2025 Genesis G80. Genesis is still dedicated to luxury cars. We actually have 3 sedans in the US, the G70, G80, and G90. Definitely a more complete sedan portfolio than we find from any of the Japanese competition, and they are all still rear-wheel drive biased. Very different than that popular Lexus ES. For 2025, the G80 has received some pretty important updates, mostly on the inside, of course. We'll take a look at those today and talk about why you might want this, or why you might want a Genesis GV80 coupe. SUV coupe, you might say? Well, not to get too ahead of myself, but if you squint, you'll notice that the G80 and the GV80 coupe have actually kind of a similar profile, because that's sort of the sedan SUV from the Genesis lineup, and the two are very similarly sized and, importantly, very similarly priced. But let's get to the G80 first. In my opinion, the G80 was already one of the best looking sedans in this segment, and apparently Genesis and their customers felt so as well, so they decided that the front end shouldn't change too much. We do have a slightly larger and slightly angrier grille, but most of the changes happen down here at the bottom of the bumper, where we find a bit more of a sporty vibe going on. And then we have the latest multi-module LED headlights from Genesis, kind of similar to what we find in the GV80 naturally. This is a multi-module sort of ice cube style LED headlight, where we have LED high beams, LED low beams, and full LED turn signals in that twin stripe design. And those stripes wrap all the way from the front onto the side and then around the back of the G80. In addition to making the front end angrier, they wanted to give it a bit more character, so the grille has more of a 3D style nature to it. You'll notice that from a side profile, and then of course we get the more flush mounted new Genesis logo on top. At 196.7 inches long, the G80 is on the long side of this segment, but it's almost exactly the same size as the GV80 coupe. The big difference is that the G80 has a slightly longer wheelbase than the SUV cousin and a slightly lower roofline. Of course, we also get less ground clearance, which means a lower center of gravity. And, interesting twist, even though we have standard all-wheel drive, this is also a decent amount lighter than the GV80. So if you want something that's a bit sportier to drive, you definitely want to check out this before you check out the SUV coupe variant. But also, if you want more room on the inside versus an E-Class or a 5 Series or an Audi A6, you definitely want to look at this. We also have more of a sportback design in the rear, which I think is certainly attractive. This is one of the better looking angles, at least to my eye, for the G80. It doesn't really increase cargo practicality because this is still a sedan. It's not a hatchback, it's not an A7 or anything along those lines. Now, if you want even more legroom on the inside, you could take a look at something like a Volvo S80. It's about 4 inches longer than the G80, and it has a shorter hood, so it has significantly more room inside. On the other hand, you could also wait for the upcoming G80 electrified, because the electric version of this is likely going to be exactly what we see in Korea already, and that's a long wheelbase G80. It's actually been stretched almost to G90 size, and that helps compensate for the bigger battery pack underneath the vehicle and the slight loss of rear legroom that we find in the previous generation G80 electrified. Now, you should know at this point that the electric version is coming a little bit later. So if you want the refresh and the updates you're going to see, especially on the inside, you want to get the gasoline model now, or you want to wait until the electric model comes probably in the next 5 to 6 months. No refresh would be complete without new wheels, so on this 3.5-liter twin-turbo model, we find new 20-inch sort of turbine waffle-style wheels, staggered tires, 245s up front, 275s in the back. Changes out back are similarly subtle. We have the twin stripe taillight modules as we saw before. The turn signals are still red back here in North America. Most of the change happens down here at the bottom of the bumper. The 3.5-liter model gets these sort of twin Superman style exhaust tips, whereas the ones in the 2.5-liter model are a little bit more integrated into the bumper, giving you kind of a hint of the same shape, but definitely a different look. So it's a little bit easier to tell from the back which one has the bigger engine. Let me know what you think about the various styles down there at at the bottom, I actually like the rear end style of the 2.5 liter model the most, but unfortunately, the only one we've been able to drive today is the one with the 3.5. Genesis says they are actively working on new hybrid drivetrains, but at least for the moment, nothing has changed under this hood. The base model still gets a 2.5 liter 4-cylinder turbo making 300 horsepower, and the top trims still get this engine making 375 horsepower out of a 3.5 liter twin turbo V6. Both engines are mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission, sending power primarily to the rear axle, although if there's no wheel slip, the system can send up to 50% of power to the front. It can go a little over 50%, assuming the rear wheels are slipping. The dynamics of this system are very different than the Japanese competition, because at least for the moment, the primary Japanese competitors are the Lexus ES, which is a front-wheel drive sedan, or the Acura TLX, which is primarily a front-wheel drive sedan, but you can get Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. Now, super handling all-wheel drive confuses some folks. This vehicle can send 100% of its power to the rear axle whenever it wants to, at whatever vehicle speed and whatever engine output it feels like. The Acura TLX, on the other hand, can send up to 70% of torque to the rear wheels in some limited driving conditions. It's not going to have a rear power bias like this. On the other hand, most of the competition has at least an option for better fuel economy than we find in the Genesis lineup. This drivetrain is rated for 19 miles per gallon combined, and you jump up to 24 miles per gallon combined if you opt for the base 4-cylinder engine. You'll get significantly better fuel economy in the BMW, for instance. The front seats are an area where I would love to see some changes from Genesis, but we don't for 2025. And that would have to do not with the driver's seat, which is pretty comfortable, but with the front passenger seat. Even in this top-end trim, it does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It does have the 4-way adjustable lumbar support, but it doesn't have the inflatable bolsters, it doesn't have the extending thigh cushion, and it doesn't have the massage functionality that we find in the driver's seat. So as far as seat comfort goes, this is one of the most comfortable seats in this segment, whereas the passenger seat is a little bit below average, if I'm honest, especially when you compare this to something like the Volvo S90 seats, which are fantastic and identical left to right. We do, however, have a memory-linked powered tilt telescopic steering column with a relatively long range of motion. That's a nice touch because not all powered columns come out as far as I would like. We also have a pretty solid amount of legroom, about 7 inches between my knees and that seat back there, and certainly enough room back here for rear-facing child seats, with me comfortably in the driver's seat at 6 feet tall. My legs are also not in my chest, although the seat bottom cushion is a little bit lower to the ground than you'll find in the Genesis GV80. Seating position is definitely a difference between the two vehicles. On paper, we have very similar legroom and headroom figures front to rear, a little bit more headroom in the GV80 coupe, very similar rear headroom, but the seating position is more upright. So if you are looking for that more upright, more kitchen table kind of seating position, you want to gravitate towards the GV80. But we find notably more room in here than we find in most of the European competitions, thanks to the size of the G80. Of course, since this is a rear-wheel drive luxury sedan, and underneath me there is the rear differential and the drive shaft, etc., there's a pretty decent hump to straddle. And we have definitely bucket-shaped outboard seats. So that center seat position is significantly higher and further forward than the outboard seats. Over here with this seat all the way back in its tracks, you can see how much legroom I have in here. It's an awful lot. We have a fold-down armrest here with heated seats in the back and controls for that rear power shade. We don't know exactly what we're going to get in the upcoming electric G80. Again, expect it to be longer than the one we currently get in the US, and with that, likely some extra powered features for the back seat. In this model, we have 3-zone automatic climate control rather than 4-zone, which is a little bit more popular in some of the European options, although this likely has less componentry to go wrong in the long run. Behind the power trunk lid, we find just over 13 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That may seem on the low side for this segment, but there are a few considerations to keep in mind. Not every car company measures cargo space the same way, so there is probably a slight variation between the way that we get 13 cubic feet from this cargo area and about 15 to 16 cubic feet from some of the European models. Also though, under this load floor we find something of a unicorn, and something that we certainly don't find in the average European luxury sedan, an actual spare tire. If Genesis deleted the spare tire and they gave us this area as cargo space, we'd probably have a bigger number, but I'd rather have the spare tire than the extra cubic foot. It's also worth noting that we were able to squeeze the same number of roller bags back here as in the 5 Series or the E-Class last time we tested, and that total is 4. But if you're hoping for 60/40 folding rear seats, you don't find those in here. Instead, we just get a ski pass-through. As we look around the interior, my disclaimer is that we are in the very top end trim with all of the luxury doodads. So clearly you won't find everything in the base model, including this big panoramic moonroof, which is optional, although you will find it in the majority of G80s on the dealer lot. You'll also get height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests in most trims. We have the rear shades in this model. Those are manual in the back. You'll find the little tab right there for pulling them up and down. And then behind that we have the powered rear sunshade, which was seen in lots of luxury vehicles for a while. This model has the optional leather upholstery, and it also has the buttons so that way you can power tilt and slide the passenger seat forward. That's definitely handy if you're playing chauffeur, but I could definitely see a lot of kids playing with those buttons. That is certainly something that I would have done with my parents in the front seat. We have some contrasting piping on the bolsters there. We have sort of moderate bolstering. I think these are pretty comfortable, but again, keep in mind that the passenger seat bolsters are not adjustable like we find over on the driver's side. Moving over to the front doors, we find pretty much all soft touch materials there, including down there around that bottle holder and around that speaker grill. Those are all soft touch materials. I like the design, and I think it's aged relatively well on the door panels. This is something that I think Genesis has done really well, where Acura and Lexus have not done as good of a job tweaking over the years and keeping things fresh. Genesis has been trying to stick to a very European schedule when it comes to refreshes and redesigns for their products, and I think it really shows when you move on over to the dashboard, because versus when this generation of G80 launched, this is definitely a very different vibe going on inside. And of course, it's dominated by this absolutely enormous single OLED screen. Even though this looks like two different screens like we find in some luxury vehicles, if we actually go to the home screen, you'll notice it is in fact one continuous seamless display. It acts more or less like two different displays, however, and this is running the latest version of Genesis software, which includes wireless smartphone projection and a little bit more adjustability to the instrument cluster over here. If you want to know more about this, we're going to take a deeper dive in a future video, but here's what the home screen looks like. You have the sort of native mapping interface there, disguised to kind of look like just background information. That's kind of a nice touch. You can, of course, also get the native map in the vehicle right there on more of a regular navigation style screen, and it does support pinch to zoom. This is not running Google's map projection software or anything like that, so you're not going to get any satellite imagery, but we do have connected services free for the lifetime of the first owner, and that's going to include app access, connected systems, over-the-air updates, etc. Down below that, we find touch controls for the climate control system. A little bit too much shiny black plastic for my particular taste, although it doesn't appear that this plastic scratches as easily as some new vehicles out there. We have the engine start-stop button there, and still some physical buttons, so volume, the setup and tune knob over there that kind of takes you through some of the system options depending on what you're looking at. Dual zone climate control for the front two zones, the third, of course, for the rear in this model. Down here we have a home button, back button, and menu button, and a controller knob for the infotainment system. So if you want to use this knob or the touchscreen, that's your choice. Fingerprint sensor over here. Drive, park, neutral, that's this dial right there. It's kind of a crystal style dial. Two big cup holders over there, auto start stop, the drive mode buttons, 360-degree camera access button, and this does get the latest 360-degree camera system from Genesis, so we get the 360-degree all-around view right like that, and you can move the car around if you want to. While we're up here, we should also talk about the ambient lighting. It has been changed. We now have this carbon fiber trim strip running across the dashboard, and you can see there's that ambient lighting strip underneath that, lighting it up in the dashboard. We have what kind of looks like one big air vent running across the dashboard, but it's not. And actually, it's done really nicely. So unlike some cars where they want to have this single horizontal line across the dashboard, there's no seam here for the air vent. The vane that actually moves the air up and down, it's decently on the inside, so all you see is this single stripe there. That's kind of a nice touch. Pretty decently sized glove compartment there. I think an 11-inch tablet computer would fit, but it might be a little bit of a squeeze inside. All soft touch materials all the way down here, all the way down there to the carpet, which, nice touch also, is actually not the light cream color that we find in the carpet on the sides. So here's a good way to show that. We have cream carpet there. The carpet floor mat is dark to help show the dirt a little bit less, and then we find ambient lighting strips running right there as well. Moving back to the center console, we have a Qi wireless charging mat there. Currently, however, I have my phone plugged in to the USB ports going on the inside. We also get the new Genesis key with the buttons on the side. I kind of wish they were on the front. I'm more of a front button person than a back or side button person. Let's move over to the steering wheel because we do get a new steering wheel design. It's a two-tone unit in this model with the sport grips really nicely highlighted there, perforated leather in the middle, and slightly more of an oval shape with that flat bottom right there. I think it looks and feels really nice. We get these black shiny buttons on the face of the steering wheel. I am a little bit concerned about scratching over time on these buttons because these are buttons you're really going to be using often. It doesn't show any scratches yet, but we have to see how that's going to go long term. Over here we have a sort of fingerprint BlackBerry style control that controls that little widget right there on the instrument cluster. So you can do things like reset those options. You can also cycle through various options on that display. For instance, you can get weather, you can get your Apple CarPlay readouts, route guidance, drive power distribution, etc. And if you click and hold, you can also close that widget so that way you can get more of a calmer screen there. This little module is part of the driver monitoring system because this does have the latest highway driving assistance system, although it's not a hands-off the wheel system yet. Other nice touch here that I should last talk about is the stitched airbag cover. This really dresses up the interior and I think the driver experience more than we find in especially something like the Volvo S90, which uses a plastic airbag cover, something I've never really been the biggest fan of. If you want to know what the window switches and things look like, that's what they look like over there. All right, it's time to get the G80 out on the road, and because nothing substantive has changed under the hood, nor with the tire sizes, I'm going to go ahead and guess that the 0 to 60 and 6 to 0 stopping times are basically the same as before. So this model should go 0 to 60 right around 5 seconds or just under if you're talking about the 3.5 liter twin turbo 6. It's going to take a little bit longer with the base 2.5 liter 4-cylinder turbo. Both of those times are going to be a little bit longer than most of the European competition. Interestingly, whether we're talking about the German competition or the Swedish competition, mostly because of the design of this transmission and the weight of the G80. On the other hand, this is about 700 pounds lighter than the GV80 coupe. So if you're looking for something with a sedan profile in the Genesis window that certainly has a sportier vibe, you're going to want to take a look at this instead of that GV80 coupe. Not only is the GV80 coupe heavier, it also has more ground clearance, so the center of gravity is going to be a little bit higher, and it's going to have more of an SUV vibe. Whereas this, clearly this is going to be more typical luxury sedan. And as you'd expect, those are the classic virtues that really signal the G80. This has a really comfortable ride, it's really quiet inside, it's a little bit more aerodynamic and a little bit more fuel efficient than the GV80, so out on the open highway you're going to get a little bit less wind noise in the cabin as well. Now bear in mind that since I'm driving the top-end version, this one has the 4-corner steering system, something that you're not going to get in most G80s on the lot. That does have an impact not just on the turning circle of this particular model, it also has an improvement when it comes to handling. So if you want the sportiest version of the G80, you have to get the top-end trim. Most other versions are going to have more typical rear-wheel drive dynamics. This one, sometimes around corners, you can definitely feel the rear end moving slightly out. It's not that the rear end is actually stepping out on you, it's that 4-corner steering system doing its thing. And you will notice that in tight parking lot maneuvers, this G80 cuts a really tight corner. It actually has a turning circle pretty similar to the G80, which is considerably smaller than this. Other than that, you're probably not going to notice much difference. We have the adaptive suspension system in a wide variety of different G80 models, and they're all tuned towards the comfortable side of things. Remember that until we find the upcoming Magma models from Genesis, most Genesis models are focused on the core of the luxury segment, where a more comfortable ride with solid dynamics are more important than overtly sporty handling. Now, it's not to mean that the G80 is not a good handling vehicle, because of course we have pretty wide tires in the back, 275 width tires in the back, relatively wide tires up front, and that strong rear power bias. So this is going to be very different out on the road than even something like a TLX Type S. Yes, the TLX Type S can send some power to the rear, but it's not going to be as much as this vehicle, as I said before. That's one of the key things to keep in mind about super handling all-wheel drive. They do a really good marketing push, and it feels really great in some situations, but it's not going to be the same thing as a rear-wheel drive biased drivetrain. Not just because of the amount of power, but also because of the weight balance. This has a perfect 50-50 weight balance in almost every trim, very similar to what we find in the BMW and the Mercedes. And the TLX Type S, it's going to be solidly front heavy. And that means that going up a hill and going down the hill, you're going to get two very different feels. You get that power to the rear, that torque vectoring feel going up the hill. Going down the hill, you're definitely going to notice that front heavy nature in the TLX. And of course in the Lexus ES, you have to get the naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine in order to get all-wheel drive. You can't combine all-wheel drive and the V6. So there's really nothing even approaching the performance levels you'll find in the base version of the G80. And that's pretty logical because the competitor to this used to be the Lexus GS, but they decided to give up on that model. And now you have to step quite far up the ladder into the Lexus LS to get something that returns to this formula. And that's perhaps one of the other interesting things about the G80. The other way to look at this is it's kind of a discount Lexus LS, because the LS has very similar power figures, relatively similar performance numbers, very similar driving dynamics. It's a little bit bigger in the back seat, but honestly, the interior doesn't really feel any more premium than this model, and it's going to be an awful lot more expensive. The one area where Genesis continues to struggle is fuel economy, however. If you're looking for 30 miles per gallon, if you're looking for 25 miles per gallon even, you are certainly not going to find it in the G80, or obviously the G90. And that is one of the unusual twists in this product lineup. If you want a more efficient option or a greener option, there is of course the full electric G80, something that few other companies have tried to pursue, but a lot more shoppers are out there buying the hybrids, especially from Lexus, and there are a reasonable number of plug-in hybrids rolling off the lots when it comes to the Europeans as well, especially that Volvo S90. The S90 will not only get significantly better fuel economy than this, it's also going to be notably faster thanks to that plug-in hybrid system. 455 horsepower is definitely quite impressive out of that combination of the electric motor in the back and the drivetrain up front. But it's not going to feel like this. That's one of the few vehicles where you can get oversteer and torque steer at exactly the same time, and while that is certainly an awful lot of fun, I wouldn't normally call that traditional driving dynamics. Until we actually see what Genesis has cooking for their hybrid and plug-in hybrid drivetrains, if you want the greener options, you're going to have to gravitate towards those full electric options, or you're just going to have to accept the fact that you'll get 50 to 60% better fuel economy in a decent number of the competition. And it is worth noting that the most efficient version of the G80 is actually still a little bit less efficient than the BMW 540i, which has a notable amount more power than the base model and still better performance than the 3.5-liter twin-turbo G80 that we're driving here. On the other hand, if you're looking for a well-built, solid driving vehicle that really makes you feel special as you're driving down the road, you know, there's not too many options in this segment that are going to be better than this. Now to the details. This is going to start at $58,350, including destination, and it's on sale at the same time that you're watching this video. That's going to give you the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo, 300 horsepower, 24 miles per gallon, imitation leather upholstery on the inside, and standard all-wheel drive. That is notably more expensive than the G80 has been in the past, but the G80 was a screaming deal before, and now I think it's a solid deal, depending on exactly what you want to compare this against, of course. If you were to try and compare this to an Acura or a Lexus, the Genesis is going to seem expensive. A Lexus ES350 starts at $43,215. But that gets you a car that is significantly less premium. It's front-wheel drive, not all-wheel drive, certainly not rear-wheel drive biased. It's going to be a very different vehicle intrinsically. The closest entry to this in the Lexus lineup used to be the Lexus GS, but the GS no longer exists. Structurally, dynamically, fit and finish, quality-wise, etc., this is significantly closer to the Lexus LS than the Lexus ES, and this is a lot less expensive than the LS. Now, that makes sense, of course, because in the Genesis lineup, we also have the Genesis G90, which is the direct LS competitor. And in the Lexus and Acura lineup, this occupies a space that those manufacturers simply choose not to compete in anymore. But the Germans, they definitely do. The Audi A6 with all-wheel drive starts at $59,790, and the BMW 530i xDrive starts at $61,195. Now, you will get slightly better fuel economy in most of the European options, whether we're talking about the Germans or the Swedish options, but price-wise, they're going to be really quite similar, with the Genesis generally being a little bit less expensive and having more standard feature content, especially in the top-end trims like this model, where we find nicer upholstery and some of the additional tech features like the soft closed doors that this model has on it. Now, if you want some of the features that you saw on this model, like the panoramic moonroof and the Bang & Olufsen audio system, you have to step up to the advanced package. You still get the 2.5-liter turbo, but you'll be spending $63,150. If you want real leather upholstery, the 360-degree camera, you want the massaging seats, and a number of other additional features like the digital key system, that's going to be in the Sport Prestige package, which starts at $69,600. So you can see, still in that 2.5-liter turbo, we're $10,000 above the entry point. But what if you want this engine? For 375 horsepower, you're going to need deeper pockets, but not as much deeper as I had expected. The next step up from there is the $70,800 base 3.5-liter V6 model, which gives you yet more features versus that top trim 3.5-liter model, like the heated rear seats, the power rear shade, and the manual side shades in the back. And of course, if you want all of the options on your G80, it's going to be more expensive than that, but it's still going to be less expensive than the top-end trims of the BMW 540i. Now, performance-wise, this is not exactly in the same category as the BMW, because that BMW 3-liter inline-six is pretty darn peppy, and BMW is probably underrating it. Genesis is probably being right on the nose with their power rating, so it's definitely going to be quicker 0 to 60. But I think this is actually a little bit more comfortable, and in terms of the interior fit and finish, it is right in line with the German competition. Before we get back to the European competition, let's talk about what I think is the most direct competitor to the G80, and that would be the Genesis GV80 Coupe. The profile is very similar. It's really the 21st century sedan, or sportback, whatever you want to call it, because the key difference in terms of its shape and its structure is that it doesn't have a trunk, it has a liftback. The rear end is a little bit less dramatic than this. It's a little bit less horizontal, a little bit more vertical, but that does not translate into that much more headroom on the inside. And it doesn't translate into more legroom either. The wheelbase is a little bit shorter than the G80. The roofline is a little bit taller, but a lot of the height actually comes from the ground clearance increase in the GV80. So if you're looking for something that's a bit easier to get in and out of, the GV80 may actually be better for you, because here you're certainly going to be stepping down into the sedan in that more traditional format. If you want greater cargo practicality, you'll find about double the cargo capacity in the GV80 Coupe versus the G80 sedan. And of course, we have the practicality of that hatch in the back. On the downside for the GV80, it is several hundred pounds heavier. It's not going to be quite as fuel efficient as the G80, and it's certainly not going to be as much fun to drive. So if you want the better driving vehicle, it's clearly going to be the sedan. I also like the ride quality in the G80 just a little bit better, something I hadn't expected, but I think that this does have a better ride than the GV80. That kind of goes with the SUV mission, of course. Price-wise, the two are very, very close. As far as starting price goes, the GV80 is only going to be $600 more than the base version of the G80. And of course, they share engines and transmissions, and they also share the vast majority of the interior features and functions, etc. Of course, if you wanted to spend less on your next vehicle, you could look at the other Genesis models in the lineup, or you could get a certain number of the competitive vehicles. This is going to be priced an awful lot like the German competition, but depending on which features you're looking for, some of them may actually be a little bit less expensive. However, this is actually going to lease for at least $100 less than the BMW, the Audi, and several $100s less than the average Mercedes competitor. Remember that about 70% of BMW 5 Series and E-Class models are leased as of the last time I checked, and this lease deal is definitely lower. Now, versus something like the Volvo S90, that's the last competitor we should talk about. I really like the S90. It's really focused on fuel efficiency. There is, of course, the really powerful plug-in hybrid system available as well, but dynamically, the G80 is superior. The S90 starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle. The plug-in hybrid is a hoot and a half to drive, but it's certainly nothing like the G80 in terms of its general vehicle dynamics. On the other hand, it does have a really big back seat. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you get? Would you get G80 or would you get GV80? The two vehicles are so alike that I think this is a really hard question to answer. But it's just about as hard, honestly, as X6 versus 5 Series or GLE Coupe versus Mercedes-Benz E-Class. I'm going to be intrigued to see how Genesis sedan sales go. They are really dedicated to the sedan format. Again, they have 3 of them in the lineup, and they have said that G80 sales have been on an upward trend. But we now have that GV80 Coupe to compete very directly for the hearts and minds of the Genesis shoppers that are out there. Let me know what you think about that. Hit us up down there in the comment section. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And you can always, of course, write your questions in or call us down there at that number below and leave us your questions in the voicemail box. See all of you later.